Another story that you tell in the book, with obviously fascinating political resonance, is about the Berlin Wall
Yeah.
uh, and the protests in what was then East Germany that ultimately led to the toppling of the wall. And the way that you tell that, it seems almost as though the protesters arrived at the moment when they toppled the wall, less out of a desire to exchange one political system for another, or even out of a sense that they were so much worse off than the people on the other side. But many of them went because everybody else was going. It's not quite FOMO in action, but it does feel like that is part of that conversation, isn't it?
Yeah, well, it really also highlights this difference in for scientists. But that was like, if you look 20 years ago at like where the science was and what people were doing, um, it was really, really different. It was, the early 90s, mid 90s, and this sociologist was basically driving to to the, one of the main wall protest sites, and then just getting out of his car and asking people, why did you join? And that's sort of the state of the art of the science and sociology at the end of the 20th century. And what was striking about his results is that he actually did this phenomenal amount of data collection. So he had like, over 1,000 people, filling out surveys and giving these kinds of detailed responses. And grievances and discontent and the promise of capitalism and the opportunities in a free nation, like all those things that we hold on to when we try to describe change, certainly they were there, but none of them explained why it happened then. And the only triggering event that he could sort of get a grip on was people's social networks. Was that when people's social networks started to activate, there was this sort of collective coordination process. And that's what winds up being interesting when we look at, stories of social change. It's how does that coordination process take hold? How does it sort of coalesce within a social network? And then how does it spread so that lots and lots and lots of people who are maybe different from the initial people who were interested, they're not activists, they're regular folks, and they may be different in any number of ways, but they all wind up coordinating on this sort of massive mobilization. And again, we saw that with Black Lives Matter, and we saw that with many of the change movements in the U.S. How does that happen? And the story of social networks really, I think, came to the forefront with that study in Berlin, that we all really appreciated. That was the story of social change. And then a sort of similar analysis had just been done on the civil rights movement, and found basically the same thing. That when you try to explain like the mobilization around civil rights, all of the stories of injustice and beliefs in freedom and civic equality, they had been there for a long time. But what happened around the movement itself was just this massive coordinating network that started to get established in infrastructure. And we see this today when we look at like Stacey Abrams in Georgia. She talks about the kind of infrastructure she had to create to build the support for this kind of movement. And that's really what this book is about what those infrastructures are, like how to identify them, how to, in some cases, build them, like in the case of an organization where you're trying to initiate change around, for example, gender and the treatment of women in the organization, but also how to sort of target them, how to like look at a sort of a community or a society and figure out where the places are where change is really going to take hold, and places where if you try to initiate it, it's just going to stumble, even though people may be equally motivated, it's just never going to take off. And the Berlin Wall story winds up being like one of our original analysis and really sort of deep insights into the fact that we have to understand social networks to understand these change processes.
It's really fascinating. And, I wanted to ask you about one other thing, specifically maybe to do with Egypt and East Germany, although perhaps it has ramifications here as well. So before the Arab Spring, as you point out, Hosni Mubarak was the president. He was authoritarian. He was supported by a very powerful military. There were limited freedoms, limited press freedoms, limited freedoms of assembly and commentary and government criticism. So fast forward through the whole Arab Spring, and where are we now? We have a President Sisi who is highly militarized, supported by an authoritarian regime. There are limited press freedoms. There are limited freedoms of assembly. I find myself wondering if there has been any change. I also
Yeah.
have a question that this is not something I know personally well at all, but if you were a working class man in Dresden in 2020, does the world feel all that changed to the one that you might have expected to inhabit in 1989? So I guess my question here is, things happened because of large groups of people networking, but did change happen?
Yeah, I think the Egypt case is actually really interesting to hold side by side with the Berlin Wall, because the Egypt case is frustrating because there was this major overthrow, but at the end, the military got involved, and then it wound up sort of kind of going back to a kind of government that unfortunately resembles the one that was there before. Tunisia is a counterexample. Tunisia is one where like you saw change in like a democratic governance, and there are many counterexamples in surprising locations, like in Guatemala. The Renuncia movement emerged through this kind of peaceful, distributed, collective, coordinated mass action that wound up ousting the president, first the vice president, and the president, in a really kind of peaceful democratic transition without even like military conflict. And so we have these cases of these kinds of change initiatives leading to something else. And so I think it's a really big question is, well, what determines what that something else is? And I think that there's more to tell in the story of change, which is what happens next. And I think that like with Black Lives Matter in the US, that's one of the questions is what's going to happen next, right? But the initial question is, how do you ever get a large group of people who are aware of problems, but simply don't mobilize around them, to organize and announce that change is needed, and then to really advance that change in a way that can't be ignored, that forces some kind of change to happen? And then what happens next is, I think built into the history of nations and also into the internal institutions and the structures that are there to allow for new kinds of governance to take over. And I think the US is promising in that regard, that new laws are being instituted, new legislation is being developed around, managing policing practices locally, but it's federal legislation, and that's a first. And so I believe that there are institutions that can make this transition more effective for, permanent kinds of change. I would say that the Berlin Wall case is actually one where, yeah, people's lives changed dramatically. When the wall came down, I assume lots of people who live in Berlin and lived through that time. And when I've spoken to people who, went through that transition, it was a very big moment historically for the lives of Berliners and for Germans more generally, that, all of a sudden, the sort of the East versus West, that kind of division in the border and that kind of oppression that had been there since the Nazi regime and then into the, Stalinist and Soviet regimes, and finally was gone. And it was this, Berlin just exploded with like life and joy and became a very different place very, very quickly.
Berlin definitely did, and that's why I mentioned Dresden, because I wanted to sort of say, yeah, if you're out of the local situation in Berlin, where clearly the city had been cleaved in two,
Yeah.
and so of course when it was reunited, when people were allowed to socialize, without that obstacle, and when the
But
capital,
I want to say the of course thing isn't necessarily of course, right? Because any number of things could have happened. Because that's the decades, something like half a century of living like that, right? So those cleavages could have been sustained. It could have been the case that people internalized social norms and they felt actually more comfortable, and then then that would need to be explained too. So I think that what happened, like the resulting state of Berlin, is like one of the best case scenarios we could hope for, which is that the city actually embraced that freedom and did something remarkable with it. Yeah.
Hachette,